Okay. Hi, Robert Jackman. Welcome to the Conscious Parenting Podcast. It is my honor to meet with you today and to have this privilege to interview you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Same here. Thank you. Robert Jackman is a psychotherapist and a best-selling author of the book Healing Your Lost Inner Child. His work focuses on healing the inner child as well as many other specialties. But today, our conversation is about the inner child, the wounded inner child, and how that impacts our adulthood. And today, we'll be diving into the depth of the inner child, understanding how the inner child is wounded and how we can take steps towards our healing. And so thank you again, Robert. And without further ado, let's get started.
Great.
So for for someone who doesn't know what the inner child is, they haven't done the inner work. It's a term that's commonly used in the healing world. But for someone who does not know what that is, what is the inner child?
So in the early part of the 20th century, Carl Jung coined the phrase or the idea of the inner child. And this is the part of us that carries this childlike wonder, curiosity, hopefulness, innocence. And so Jung speculated that we carry this into our adult life. And then for a matter of simplicity, what I reference as the wounded inner child is that's a part of us that as children, we had some sort of trauma or dysfunction in our childhood families. And that essentially that childlike innocence or curiosity or hopefulness got wounded in a sense. And so that wounded part doesn't mature with the rest of us. So that wounded part stays stuck or frozen in time. And it's just on repeat over and over, not really connecting with the rest of us chronologically. And so as adults, what happens is we might get triggered by something that was similar to our trauma in our childhood. And that wounded part steps in front to protect us, just like that part stepped in front of us as a child. And so we don't realize we're doing it, but that wounded inner child steps in front of us and gets really loud or maybe shuts down and withdraws. And so that's the part that later people will say, why did I do that? Why did I react that way? And that's their wounded part that's not healed.
Wow. So the frozen in time is really something to highlight. And I love how you termed that frozen in time, because it really paints a picture for me. I know there's an aspect of me that's not fully present in the now moment with the adult self. And
That's right.
so it's as if you're saying that there is an aspect of we're not completely present and whole in our full expression because there's a part of us that is wounded that needs some healing from what you're saying.
That's right. That's the part that is looking for healing. So, but like I said before, a lot of us don't realize what's happening. And so part of my wounding from my childhood was I was the peacemaker in my family. And so as an adult, if my friends were upset or my family was upset, that wounded part of me would step in front of the adult me. That wounded part would step in front and like, okay, how do I make this better? How do I calm this down? How do I smooth that over? Because that wounded part was really activated at that point and was just doing all these activities that I did as a child. So it's not until we recognize this pattern that's happening within us that we're able to heal it. We're able to say, oh, okay, I see what's happening. And you mentioned my book, Healing Your Lost Inner Child. What I do is I take people through a process, the heal process of identifying these wounded impulsive responses that originated in childhood that are happening, that are on repeat in our adult life.
That's powerful. This is so important because I can see how this impacts our ability to function as an adult in today's world.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to access parts of us that we would need in today's present moment. If we don't have that part of us present, how is someone able to have functional relationships or healthy relationships? How does that impact our ability to relate with each other, instead of acting from a wounded place?
That's right. That's exactly right. And so, I believe that we're all doing our best. What I say, the phrase I've sort of coined is that we've come by our wounding honestly, meaning that as
Mm.
children, we were just doing our best as kids, but we were in our childhood families. Maybe there was trauma, maybe there was abuse that was happening, or maybe it wasn't abusive, it was just maybe highly dysfunctional. So as kids, we take in everything that's in our environment. If you think about the family, the household, the neighborhood, as children, our world is only so big. And so anything that happens in that world, in our sphere, really has a huge impact on a child. So
Mm.
if mom and dad are upset, so I'm referencing myself again. So if my mom and dad argued, that really upset me because that was my world.
Mm.
That was all I knew. I knew our house, I knew our neighborhood, but it wasn't like I could get in my car at 8 years old and drive away and go into another space. That was
Mhm.
my world I was in.
Mm.
So it greatly impacts our view of ourselves and our world when there's any kind of dysfunction in that space.
Wow, well said. So that you mentioned two things I wanted to talk about, because you mentioned trauma and how there are certain things that creates that you mentioned abuse, you mentioned trauma,
Yep.
and dysfunction in the family. And so can we talk a little bit about that, and how these different factors create wounding is in terms of the inner child and how the inner child perceives that?
Mm-hmm. So, just like the term inner child, trauma is thrown around a lot. And when I work with people, they'll say, well, I never really had any big traumas in my life. And I will say, well, I didn't either.
Mm.
I wasn't beaten. I wasn't sexually abused. I didn't have these horrific traumas that a lot of children endure. But what I had was growing up in an alcoholic household. I learned to change myself to try to make that world work. So for me, my wounding goes over the span of my childhood. So it's like all of these different behaviors I did trying to make my world feel safe. So the other example is there are many children, many adults who are probably watching today who will say, my mom and dad did everything, they provided everything for us. But one thing I noticed a lot is that a lot of people have grown up in where their parents are emotionally unavailable.
Mm.
So they're physically there, but they're not giving the child nurturing. They're not hugging the child. They're not really attending to the child's emotional needs. They're attending to physical needs, but not emotional needs. And so that's another way that inner child wounding can develop.
Wow, you just hit the nail on the head right there, Robert, because that is a silent one that I think is so subtle. The
Mm-hmm.
physical is so easy to see, but um, the emotional abandonment, and I know that I've done some work on this because people as if adults are not doing the inner work or parents are not doing the inner work, they may not be aware of how the emotional side happens. And I think that is the key. I would love to shed light on that. You mentioned taking care of the emotional needs of the child, nurturing, hugging.
Mm-hmm.
So can you expand further on that the inner child and what the inner child needs to feel emotionally secure and loved?
Well, I'll just say children in general, we all need to have consistency in our life. So it's not about, what I want to make very clear with everyone watching today is that this is not about perfection. You're going to be you. You're going to be perfectly imperfect, and as long as you're trying your best, then that's 90% of it. Um, what's important to recognize is really attending to what your child is presenting. So your child might really feel that they need to be close to you. They might be clingy. They might want to talk. They might want hugs. That's all beautiful. As long as you're able to give that, as long as you're able to acknowledge that with the child. The wounding comes in when the child goes to a parent and says, I really need a hug today. And the parent might have an idea like, well, this kid needs to toughen up. I'm not going to give them hugs every time they're looking for a hug. And so then the child walks away not receiving that nurturing. And then the child might begin to believe that they aren't worthy of that or something's wrong with them. They feel that emotional abandonment by the parent. And so the child then begins to put together a story that the child isn't worthy because of the parent's behavior. So children, there's an expression that children are great observers, but lousy interpreters, meaning that kids take all of this stuff in. As children, we took in our whole world. We're like, oh, okay, I see everything that's happening. But we then interpret what's happening in our world based on our knowledge set at the time, which is for children is pretty limited until we get older. So it's really important for parents to talk with their children, ask their children what they need, instead of the parents always determining and projecting onto the child what they think the child needs.
Right. That's powerful. Just having that conversation and really tuning into what the child needs. Even from growing up from a baby all the way up,
Yeah.
from that age, nurturing, attending to their needs, and then into the toddler, older from there. So for throughout the span of your childhood, if the parent is consistently providing that nurturing and being available emotionally, attentive to the child's needs, then there's the emotional abandonment that the inner child could face. That is something that could be avoided completely if the parent is willing to do their part in being present and available for the child.
I would say the chances are that it's lessened.
Lessened.
But
Okay.
we each have our own personality. We each have our own emotional needs. And so you can have a very emotionally available parent, but that's still not enough for that child. And so maybe there's something else going on with that child that the parent isn't consciously aware of. So it's about talking with children and seeing in different ways, reading them stories, modeling behaviors for them so the child picks up, learns, sees effective relational behaviors, and really checking in with the child and see what they're doing. It's really watching behavior. I have to clarify that I'm not a child psychotherapist. I work with teens and adults. But in the context of the inner child wounding, it's really important for the parents to look at, okay, what is my child presenting? So if there's something that's sort of standing out for you, like, I don't know why he's always, reading in the corner, let's say, for example. Well, it could be that the child just likes to read in the corner, and that's good. Or it could be, very typical wounded response a lot of times is children will retreat into a world of fiction or fantasy as a way to self-soothe and cope when everything else in the household is very chaotic and disruptive. So maybe that's what the child is demonstrating. So it's just recognizing, looking at what your child's doing, what they're telling you through their behaviors.
Right. Listening to them, being more attentive and listening to the child. I know depending on the culture of the parent and their upbringing, sometimes it's the parental authority versus, listening to the child and having that type of relationship where the child's voice is heard.
That's right. And a lot of times as adults, we project onto children our own stuff. Unknowingly, we project that onto them. So examples would be when parents would say to a child, like, why did you do that? I can't believe you just did that. That was so stupid. All
Mm.
right. So, packed in that short statement is a lot of shaming, right?
Mm.
And so the child is then, like, I'm sorry, I won't do it again. Okay. Or they might burst out in crying, or they might burst out in a temper tantrum. Um, so that's the sort of thing that over time, if a parent consistently uses that shaming language, that's really going to create some inner child wounding.
Shaming you mentioned shaming, Robert, and that's such an important topic because shame really erodes the self-esteem, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It affects them long term
It,
severely.
it really does. And so, um, we is a very natural, normal part of us living life. So it's not that the shame is bad, because shame creates some guardrails for us in society as far as behaviors. But when shame is used as a weapon, when shame is used as a way to correct behavior, that's where it creates this wounding.
Mm. Wow, that is a powerful piece. So if parents are unaware of the inner child and how to communicate so that the child feels safe
Mm-hmm.
and loved, even in the correction, then that could create adverse effects later on in their ability to develop and create that frozen inner child, like you've mentioned, where
Right.
they have this repeat feeling of not feeling okay with their mistakes, for example.
Not feeling good enough, always feeling less than, not
Mm-hmm.
feeling that they can do anything right. And so I just encourage the viewers to really check in with themselves to see, okay, what sort of language am I using for this corrective behavior? You
Mm-hmm.
know, how am I saying it? How is it coming across? Really differentiate between that loving the child, hating the behavior sort of thing. Where you're really discerning. I love you, but this is you can't run up and touch the stove, and in an age appropriate way, sort of thing.
Right. So instead of shaming, would you consider shame abuse? Is that a form of abuse, or is that just classified differently as something else?
Well, again, it's how shame is being used,
Okay.
meaning that if I'm as a child, if I'm always told that was really stupid, why are you doing that? I can't believe you're doing that. I thought you were smarter than this. Boy, I'm just at that moment, I'm just loaded up with a lot of shame right there. I feel pretty bad about myself.
Right.
So so that's where it just can become toxic.
Yes. So over time, if a parent is not aware of their shaming language and uses that to correct the child,
Mm-hmm.
long term, the child grows up with that wounding and has to deal with that later in life.
Yeah. And so as adults, when I'm working with adults, they'll say, well, I just never thought I could do anything. I don't think I can do anything. I'm really not good at anything, or I don't feel worth very much. And then I'll ask them about their childhood, and they'll tell me they never had any abuse. And then I'm like, okay, well, where did this idea come from?
Mm-hmm.
Because we're not born with this idea that we're less than. So somewhere along the way, that adult got this information as a child, and so that's the wounding that I see as a therapist. I'm like, okay, I'm hearing what you're saying, but this is really standing out for me, because where did this come from?
Right. And so so these hidden things, so it takes a lot of responsibility for a parent to know their impact and role on the child's development and their future
Mhm.
self and who they can become and how
Mm-hmm.
they can interact in the world. So the responsibility of a parent is really one with great, it takes great courage to be a parent, but also comes with great responsibility, to be able to mold a child and have that level of impact on a child's development. What would you say for parents who, they have their own inner wounded child? Is this something that maybe as parents we have to do our own inner work so that our wounding is not passed on to the child, as you mentioned projection earlier?
Probably the greatest gift that a parent could give their child is for the parent to do their own healing work. And because that will create a tremendous level of self-awareness within the adult, where they're understanding themselves and they're understanding their wounding that they may have gotten along the way growing up, and how that wounding is coming out.
Mm-hmm.
And so in my book, Healing Your Lost Inner Child, in the first chapter, I give the reader 89 different impulsive response tools that are essentially wounded expressions that we do, as far as like shutting down, ignoring, lashing out, blaming, all those sorts of things. Those are the wounded tools we learned in childhood that we carried into our adult life. So if a parent is saying, okay, I keep doing this, I'm recognizing that I shut down, or I'm recognizing that I just can't control my anger a lot of times. If they can work on that there's going to be a trickle down effect where that's going to then really help the child and help the household in general. Because whether they like it or not, their wounding, the parents' wounding, is spilling over onto that whole household, and that entire family structure is being impacted by the emotional wounding.
Mm. Yeah, so from that is so important, because if parents don't have that self-awareness, then the child carries that, you can call it whatever, karma, or carries that same projections, those wounding,
Mm-hmm.
and is now responsible for doing that work to heal their lives later in
Exactly,
adulthood.
exactly, because this is where you might have heard the term intergenerational trauma.
Right.
So it's a fancy way of saying you're just passing down what you learned to your kids.
Right.
So we're passing down what how we were taught as children, and then we do the same thing to our children. And so it's just that wounding keeps on getting passed down through generations within the family. So the more we can become aware of that, then we can heal it. So that acknowledgement is huge. The biggest thing I want folks to know is that, we talk a lot about this inner child wounding, and I was talking about those wounded tools we use, those expressions we have. The anecdote, what really heals this is boundaries.
Mm.
So setting boundaries within ourselves and with others will be the most important thing that we can do to heal these patterns. And it's also the one of the most important skills that a parent can teach a child, is
Mm.
how to have strong boundaries, healthy boundaries. And so if you allow me, let me describe two different boundaries just real quickly. So one is what I call internal boundaries. So internal boundaries are a promise or commitment I make to myself. Like I'm going to try to go to the gym at least twice a week. So that would be just a boundary statement I'm saying to myself. And an external boundary are things we say to other people. No, I really don't want to do that. Or I feel hurt when you talk to me that way. So they're
Mm.
statements we're making to other people. Children watch us, our behaviors all the time. Just like when we were children, we watched mom and dad or our caregivers all the time. We were watching them. They were teaching us how to be an adult. And so if our parents or caregivers did not have healthy boundaries, a lot of times that means that we won't have healthy boundaries. So if we grow up in a household where there's enmeshment, which means that there's no sense of boundaries of where one person ends and one begins, then that's what we're just going to bring that into our adult life. So whatever we were taught in childhood, we're going to bring that into our adult life because that's what we know. That's what we think is normal.
Right. And I love that you brought up boundaries. This is such a big, very, very important topic. Boundaries, I don't think is taught enough. I learned boundaries through my mentor. I'm still learning boundaries today. And I love that you bring this up as a solution. And I'd love for us to, if you could we could dive deeper into this. You mentioned the internal boundaries and the external boundaries. And then you also mentioned something that I'd love to dive into, which is enmeshment, because I'd love to learn more about that and educate the audience and what that is so that they're conscious of what enmeshment is. Now, to create the safe container for the inner child, you're mentioning boundaries is essential. So, can you describe like a healthy boundary? Like, what does that look like?
A healthy boundary is how I reference it is checking in with your gut. So if you're in a relationship and your partner or your friend says something like, "Gosh, why are you wearing that today?" All right, so that's again an example of shaming language. So someone says, "Why are you wearing that today?" Our gut reaction is this feeling of like embarrassment or like, "What do you mean? Why did you just say that to me?" So immediately a boundary violation occurred. The person said that to us. We're impacted with feeling that, and we're offended, we're ashamed, we're having all these sort of rush of feelings right away. But that's a boundary violation. So the gut reaction is, "You hurt me." But a lot of times what happens with people with not so strong boundaries, fuzzy boundaries, they'll say, "Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Should I change? Is this bad?" So they'll start to try to correct the situation, as it were. Someone with strong boundaries would say, "This is what I chose to wear today. I'm sorry you don't like it, but this is what I'm wearing."
I can tell the
You
difference.
know?
Wow, I'm just learning. So this is so powerful.
And then maybe carry that up with, it really hurts me how you said that to me. So that's a demonstration of setting boundaries in the moment. What happens a lot of times as adults, especially in our friendships, someone will say something ridiculous like that, and you might like, "Well, okay, whatever," and you just go, the day moves on, but yet you feel that boundary violation, you feel that shame still kind of coating you. And that's where I encourage people to go back and say to that person, "Yesterday we met for lunch and you said this about my outfit, and that I want you to know that that hurt me. I was offended by it." People who respect our boundaries, they will say, "Oh, I know I said that, and I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that."
Right.
And then we accept their apology and then we move on. People who don't respect our boundaries, and we say, "What you said yesterday hurt me." And the disrespectful person will say, "Well, that was a ridiculous outfit. I can't believe you wore that." Right? So they're still sort of stuck on that part. They're not hearing our boundary statement. They're not respecting it. They're overriding it. They're paving over it. They're sort of gaslighting us in a way of like saying that we're the problem. And they just want to move on. So it's really important for us to pay attention to those interactions as adults to really evaluate, is this a good friendship for me or not? So tying this back to the inner child, someone who doesn't have a strong boundary system learned to not have boundaries in childhood. So when, as an adult, if they're in that situation, that friend says, "Why are you wearing that today?" The wounded part of us feels shame, feels like not good enough, feels like I can never do anything right. And so that's how our inner child wounding keeps on playing out, because that's the narrative that we've been telling ourselves, and this outside person just validated that.
Mm. You know, the entire thing about boundary is so deep. There's so many pieces to this. You know, you mentioned the internal, the external, and that the communication of what we allow in from other people,
Mm-hmm.
and our ability to communicate our boundary to others, is what
Yep.
I also heard you say. So the ability to speak up and protect yourself.
Yep.
And so you're saying by, the parent being able to have healthy boundaries and modeling that for the inner child is able to see what boundaries look like.
That's right. So it could be, the family sitting around the table, and maybe the mom and dad, the adults are saying, "Oh, well, this person, she said this to me, or he said this to me today, and that really hurt me. I was really hurt by what they said." So the child is picking up, "Oh, okay, so um, mom or dad was really hurt by that. They're upset by that." And maybe in an age appropriate way, maybe the parents could then say, "I went back and I told him or her that upset me, and we worked it out." So in that very short exchange, the child is hearing how the parent dealt with that boundary violation.
Mm,
So children, again, are watching us all the time. They're watching us to learn how to be adults. So we're modeling behavior for them. So the clearer we are, the more healed we are, all of this is just going to come out of us naturally. It's not like we're having to force it or anything. The healed part is presenting. The healed part is showing up in the family structure. So the children are recognizing, "Oh, okay, this is how you have healthy relationships." Whereas, I'll tie in something. So you wanted to talk about an enmeshment today.
right.
So enmeshment essentially is a no boundary sort of situation. And I was just writing about enmeshment for my next book that's coming out next year, about how I was enmeshed with my mom. So my dad, who was a really lovely man, but he would come home and drink, and alcohol would change him. And my mom would kind of get overwhelmed by all of this. She would try to, like, calm him down essentially, but that didn't work. There's a whole other story about that. But what my mom would do, let's say the next day, she would then confide in me how she was feeling about my dad's behavior.
Mm,
And I'm just like a teenage boy, right?
right.
So all of this was really overwhelming to me. And so all of a sudden, I had to set aside all of my childlike innocence and grow up really fast, because now my mom is confiding in me with adult things.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm having to hold that space for her as she's talking, and trying to, like, well, okay, like, I'm scrambling, thinking of what I needed to do to help her.
Right.
I didn't have any answers for her, but I didn't know that at the time. I felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where my mom and I didn't have good boundaries with each other. I didn't have any good boundaries within myself to say, "Wait a minute, mom, this is too much." Like, I didn't have that language as a teenage boy.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how that enmeshment happens, where we were enmeshed with each other. There wasn't a clear boundary structure. I didn't know how to set boundaries for myself. My mom wasn't setting boundaries within herself, essentially where she was saying, I can't share this with him. This is too much for a child. She was just in pain. So it's like we all were sitting in this pain. We all were trying to make dysfunctional family work.
Wow, that's so deep. Thank you for sharing that. The
Mm-hmm.
understanding of the enmeshment. I feel like I understand more clearly what that looks like and how essential boundaries are to protect the child from
Yeah.
um, the parent passing on the emotional baggage. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, here's all my stuff here, handle it. You're
Pretty
talking,
much.
like, oh, you're talking to an 8-year-old, doesn't have the capabilities and the coping mechanisms to do that.
Yep.
That is a lot to handle for an inner child or child at that time.
That's right. But now you can maybe more easily see then how I felt as a boy. I'm like, okay, I need to grow up really fast. And the term is I became parentified, which
Mm,
just means that I had to grow up too fast to handle these adult issues that I was being presented with. And so my wounding then shows up in the form of being controlling, being over responsible, overcompensating, trying to fix, because those were all the sort of responsibilities that I was were being put on me as a boy. That I was like, okay, I need to do something here. Here's my mom. She's crying. She's upset. I don't know what to do. So that's where that wounded part. That's how I got wounded.
right. And so the essential key from what you're saying, the boundaries is protects you from enmeshment. So parents would need to be doing, I wouldn't say would need to, but it would be something that would be very beneficial for the family if boundaries were something that were discussed. That's something that I'm working on myself, is what are some of the things that I want to do in front of my child, not do, what I allow and don't allow in
Right,
front of the child, type of thing. Is
right.
that something that, are there classes? Like, how does someone learn these things if they're not trained as a parent to
That's a
develop
good
those
question.
muscles?
Well, there certainly are a lot of self-help books out there. I really encourage parents to seek out therapy where they can work through their issues, because a lot of parents I work with, they get a huge amount of emotional reinforcement from their children.
Mm,
So they're not getting it from their spouses because for whatever reason their their spousal relationship isn't great, but with their kids they have all this unconditional love pouring from their kids, and that the wounded parent is like, gosh, this feels great, my kid gives me all this reinforcement and I give them reinforcement, and then there becomes this sort of too much of a closeness essentially, where then the parent just like starting to talk about all these adult issues that really aren't meant for a child, but they're not recognizing that because they feel this closeness with their child. Especially you see this a lot with like in my case with the parent and a teenage child.
right. So that parent doesn't, so they may classify it as, oh, we are close.
Mm-hmm.
We have a really close relationship. We can talk about anything, type of thing,
Yeah,
but not understanding that the child is not emotionally developed and aware to handle their stuff, you know?
yeah. Yeah, so I would just encourage parents to just do a self check and say, okay, am I sharing any, things that are too, might be too overwhelming for my child? Am I sharing that with them? And maybe I shouldn't. So just to do a gentle check in with yourself. Um, I would say that most of the people who are probably watching this program are already good parents. Uh,
Yes.
so because they're trying to better themselves, right?
Right.
They're trying to learn how to be a better parent. Well, that tells me a lot that they're probably already pretty good. It's the ones who aren't watching this program who really need to watch it.
Yeah.
It's the ones who think that they're like all that in a bag of chips that probably aren't. doing a lot of good parenting. So just trust yourself, know that you're doing a lot of good things already, but kind of what we're talking about today is about taking it a little bit step further, and where boundaries create a sense of safety in our relationships. So boundaries are the guardrails within our relationships, where I end and you begin, where I need to have sovereignty over myself, a sense of agency, and I need to find a voice to put out there to protect myself in all of my relationships.
Beautifully said. The boundaries are the guardrails of the relationship, of that container. And so how do you create, as a, you have your child, and let me know if this is within scope, but you have to create boundaries for, like, how do you respect your child's boundaries? Like, children have boundaries too. They're a sovereign being.
Yep.
We're all sovereign beings. And so, a child has their own, would an example of boundary be, maybe knocking on the door? If the door's closed, would that be knocking on the door saying, may I come in? Or maybe some parents feel they have the absolute right to just barge in because they own the house and they can walk in whenever they feel like. And it's like, I'm in charge. I open the door when I want to. Or would be showing an example of boundary be knocking the door, may I come in?
Well, that's a great example. And I was actually going to bring up an example like that. So this is perfect. um, so again, I'm not a child therapist, but what I've seen and what I hear from adults is they'll tell me stories of these boundary violations that they had as a child by their parents. And one example is a man I'm working with who told me how his dad believed that everything that was in the house that he had to know about, and so he took the doors off of the kids' rooms, and so because he didn't want the kids closing their doors. Well,
Mm-hmm.
especially as children get older, they need to have a sense of privacy, a sense of safe place. And this dad was saying, no, I'm the master of this house, and I'm taking off all the doors. You're not going to tell me what to do. So of course that does a whole number within especially the adolescent child, where they feel that they can't protect themselves essentially, and they don't feel respected. So yeah, in your example, it'd be great if parents would be like, okay, knock on the door, may I come in? Child says yes. So that's a very simple way of teaching the child about respectful language, about boundary, about advocating for themselves. It's a great, little example of that.
Right. So these subtleties, there's so many throughout the span of the child's life. There's these moments of memories and moments of interaction and modeling and all these different, it's like a movie playing out.
Right.
And the parent, if not conscious, it requires to be conscious. If you're not conscious at all, the child will be impacted some way, shape, or form if they're not acting in the highest level of to their best. Of course, no one's perfect. We get it.
Right.
We all have things, right?
Right.
But as long as they're doing the work, then there's room to improve and to create a different movie for the child to experience, for
Mm-hmm.
example. So we talked a little bit about the external boundary setting, and then you mentioned internal boundary setting, and that's also very important. So can you talk a little bit about that, for how would that impact a child if a parent did that?
Well, so internal boundary setting again is promises or commitments we make to ourselves. So an internal boundary could be I'm going to work really hard at this, or this is a goal I have, or this is something I want to do for myself. So it's something that we're telling ourselves. It's something that we're in agreement with ourselves. It could also look like, okay, well, it's okay if people put me down. It's okay if my classmate comes and punches me in the shoulder every day. That's okay. I guess I deserve that. Yeah, I guess I deserve to be treated that way. So that would be a sense of not having internal boundaries. That would be where the child learns that they don't have a right to speak up. They don't have a right to defend themselves. Well, mom and dad took the door off my room. I guess I can't really advocate for myself. I can't
Mm.
really speak for myself. And so that's setting the child up essentially to be prone to be in abusive relationships, because that child believes that they don't have a sense of agency, sovereignty, that they don't have a voice. And so that's what you see where people get into relationships with abusive folks, because they're not even recognizing that that's abuse.
Mm.
They're saying, oh, well, that's how they treat me.
Wow. So this is great because you just mentioned another major piece, which is, abuse and how unconscious we are of abuse. It's like it's become so normalized that we
Yeah.
accept it as normal because we are not aware that it's not okay. And unlearning that and through that process, as you said, therapy helps to do that, or doing that inner work or that self-healing is so important to recognize the abuse that we let in. And so that ties into that boundaries, like you mentioned. If we're used to seeing abuse as normal, there are no boundaries. And then when you get older, you go into your adult life, you receive abuse and you think it's okay.
Mm-hmm. That's
And
right.
yeah.
And we recruit or we bring people into our life that validate that narrative, which we don't know what we're doing. So if you ask someone, oh gosh, do you want to date people that are abusive to you? You're like, well, no. But subconsciously, that's what's happening, because our wounding, we're seeing the world through a wounded lens, because that wounded lens was developed in childhood for the most part.
So would you say for someone who's wounded, if they weren't beaten, a child wasn't beaten, they weren't spanked, they didn't have yelling or screaming, or they weren't shamed, to the toxic shaming rather,
Mm-hmm.
but they were emotionally abused, because that sometimes the emotional abuse is the one that's not really seen often.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk a little bit about the emotional abuse and what is emotional abuse and how does that show up?
Well, emotional abuse goes back to those examples we were saying before about, let's say, shaming language.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how a child would start to feel less than. So emotional abuse is the parent projecting their own stuff onto the child, and the child then believing that that's who they are.
Mm-hmm.
Because children really take in everything that we say as adults. We're in a position of authority in a child's life, and so they're really looking up to us to help develop their sense of self,
Right.
self-worth, self-love, self-respect, all of that. So anything that is chipping away at that sense of self is emotionally abusive. So it could come in lots of different forms, and a lot of times it is um, for the child. It's about how they're seeing the world and how they're interacting with the world, and their own sense of resiliency and their own sense of self. In other words, you could have two children, same age, growing up in the same sort of household. One sort of can surf and navigate a dysfunctional household. The other is like totally overwhelmed by everything that's going on. Because we each are unique creatures in that way. So there's not, I can't really say, how one child's going to be affected over another, how that's going to then be demonstrated as adults.
Right. So the emotional, any type of abuse. See, we talked about a couple items to bring it all into perspective. So you've mentioned, the enmeshment, not having those boundaries. We've talked about the emotional abuse, that conversation that we have with the child, how
Mm-hmm.
that impacts them. And then of course the dysfunction of the home and how things are being done internally in terms of modeling and projection and all those things.
Mm-hmm.
So someone who has whatever childhood they went through, we all go through something. what is your process, Robert, or is there something you can share today for the audience or for that person who's going through that wounding and hasn't a wounded inner child? What would be their first step towards recovery or for healing?
Well, I think the first step is beginning to acknowledge and understand how that wounded inner child is coming out in them. And again, I give the reader a lot of different examples of how that might be showing up. So it might be shutting down, it might be yelling, it might be being passive aggressive. Like I said, there's a lot of different demonstrations that it's coming out, how it's coming out. But it's that self-awareness. That's the first step, the self-awareness. So in session, that's what I'm looking for with a person as far as how they are relationally and what they think of themselves. So I'm trying to get a sense of what are the patterns and themes that keep on showing up in their life. And so the viewers can do this right now. Like, okay, what's something that I'm always doing, or what's a situation that I'm always encountering? Well, chances are that's related. That ties back into their inner child wounding.
Wonderful. So really stepping into that self-awareness is key as any adult, just to become aware of what's happening, what's the cause and effect of these paradigms so that they can start to move towards doing the work.
When we can name it, we can claim it, we can own it, we can heal it. But the first step is that awareness.
Right.
Is that sense of, okay, what am I doing? You know,
Right.
what keeps showing up in my life, sort of thing. I do want to just go back and clarify something for your viewers, that this may sound really counterintuitive to everything I've said during this whole time, but it's really important for parents, caregivers, to show children that when they're arguing, that's really important for kids to see arguments or disagreements. But the kids really need to see how that relationship is repaired after that disagreement. So a lot of times what happens is parents will say, oh, we never try to argue in front of our kids. And I'll say, well, I really want you to start doing that. They'll be like, what are you talking about? Because they think they're doing a good thing. They're sparing the kids something. But what I hear from from many adults is they'll say, I never saw my parents argue. And there's a generational thing that I see happening is parents who are between 40 and 50, they grew up with thinking that they shouldn't argue in front of their kids. And so what's happening now with like Gen Z, for kids who are like around 20, they're in relationships. And if they start to argue or have disagreements with their significant others, they think the relationship is bad and wrong, and they get out of it because they're kind of freaked out by that disagreement. You're shaking your head, yes.
Tell you why in a minute.
so it's really important. Disagreements, conflict is normal. So it's about modeling for children how to have healthy disagreement and how to have healthy reconnection, rejoining, and repair. So often in my generation, parents would argue, and then the kids would go to bed, and then the parents would then sort of make up after the kids were in bed, or the parents would, go to the bedroom or whatever and say their sorries, I love yous, but the kids never saw that. So that's why it's so important for the kids to have that behavior modeled for them. So they see, oh, okay, so you can have disagreements, but then, okay, this is how you say you're sorry. This is how you make up. Kids, it's such an important life skill for kids to really see that.
So thank you for bringing this up, because I'm a millennial, right? And I grew up in the complete, I grew up with, arguments being shown, right? But
Right,
the repair is a piece that I wasn't shown.
right.
So you're saying the repair piece is so important for children to see so that they can see the modeling of how to work through disagreements, that disagreements is part of life. There's
Yeah,
nothing wrong or right about it. It's just how do we work through it and resolve it together as a family?
very, very, very much. And what that's also teaching is another boundary example, because it's teaching how to have and to hold space for disagreements, how to have and hold space for repair and reconciliation, and how to then begin to look for that. So, for example, if someone who has healthy boundaries, they've seen this repair work, they know, okay, their parents have demonstrated that, and now they're in a relationship with someone and they're having a disagreement, but that person doesn't want to repair the relationship. Well, the child, now adult, who had that modeled for them, will be like, well, no, we need to work through this, we need to repair this, we need to be good with each other. And so that's a boundary then, that the adult would be saying, this is, we need to do this in our relationship. It's such a key part that, especially for so many people, they don't have that skill in their adult life. And in my relationship book, I talk about how to have heartfelt apologies, how to really demonstrate and model this within the family structure.
Powerfully said. I mean, that is such a key. You would not hear someone saying, yes, it's okay. And I love that you brought that in because that's a big awareness I feel like I needed to hear. And I think a lot of people would love to hear about how it is, instead of labeling it as bad, it is essential. It's just how you have that ending and that repair piece. Would that child need to have the cognitive awareness of they would need to be in an and this is what I'm asking in terms of the childhood level where that exposure is given. So if there's an argument between a parent and or between in a couple or married husband and wife, um would there need to be a discernment or a boundary on the exposure to that type of argument to a child at a specific type of age, for example? So for example, between up to 5 years old, that wouldn't be wise, or between, and that may be a child psychologist, but I wanted to ask you, since we brought it up, because of their emotional readiness for that type of exposure.
Well, what I'll say is that life happens. And so uh, parents, as much as they don't want to expose disagreements to their children, it's going to happen. So mom and dad could be in the car in the front seats and the kids in the back, and something happens and mom and dad get into it about something. So the kid, even though they might have headphones on and the tablet in front of them, they know that mom and dad are upset. They know that something's going on. But the child also is sort of watching to see what's going to happen next. And so if the parents, are able to self-regulate and calm themselves down, and then reach over, hold each other's hands and say, okay, I'm sorry I blew up like that. I'm sorry I said that. The kid's also taking that in. So yeah, there certainly are age appropriate discussions for a child to be privy to. But the main message is, this is going to happen whether or not parents like it or not. They're going to be frustrated, tired, um, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, as they say in AA. So that's going to happen. So it's just having that awareness of that sort of pit in your stomach and that elephant that's in the middle of the relationship, and just acknowledging that elephant and reaching through that pain and saying, you know what, I'm sorry I said that. I love you.
Mm.
All right. What did that take? Less than 10 seconds for me to say that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Got it. So we talked about, I mean, this is so packed with so much value for everyone listening, the beauty of repairing, communicating, knowing how to consciously communicate, being present and available for your child. And again, you mentioned earlier that it's not about perfection, it's about just doing the work. And the more awareness we can bring to our interactions and our conversations internally, externally with each other, the better we can be as parents and the more we can facilitate healthier development for our child. And if we're willing to do our own inner work, then we can mitigate passing on intergenerational trauma or patterns to the child, so they can have a healthier future.
Beautifully said.
Thank you. That's just a summary. But I wanted to see if there was any final words you wanted to say, Robert. I mean, this has been really, truly phenomenal. I mean, talking about the inner child and really understanding more, the challenges that the child faces growing up and having to deal with the emotional, physical, I mean, just overall the family structure and dealing with that. And also parents having to manage and be parents at the same time while operating as an adult. All these things that everyone has to do. I mean, I really tip my hat off to adults and for the work that you do in being able to support parents so that they can do the work. So thank you for your contribution to this society and for your work.
Well, I really appreciate that. And something I want all of your viewers to know is that each of you are doing the very best you can do. So often we are told or believe that we need to do better. And there may be some things that we need to work on to improve, but you're the best you that ever was and ever will be.
So beautiful. So moved.
There has never been anyone like you before, and there will never be anyone like you again.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's respecting, loving, trusting yourself, knowing that you're really doing the best you can with the tools you have.
Mm-hmm.
As Maya Angelou says, when we know better, we can do better.
Mm-hmm.
So it is about doing our healing work. And here I'll put in a plug for my book. So, so the Healing Your Lost Inner Child, the book and the workbook. And so the book will take you through that whole heal process that I described. And they're available on Amazon. And then my Healing Your Wounded Relationship is my book that helps people know why they're getting into relationships, sort of like why hurt people find other hurt people. And it's how our unhealed, wounded parts are searching out someone else to complement that same wounding. So the message is that there are resources available to heal these patterns, that you don't have to live with this false narrative that you may have that you're less than or not good enough or that you deserve to be treated poorly. That's not fair to you. That you can heal those wounds that you developed in childhood and that you can have a healthy, happy, productive adult life.
Beautifully said. So empowering. Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us, and for writing a book that people can use, start reading and getting to know what's going on, learn from you. And if they're ready, they can move forward into visiting your website. What is your website?
Well, my website is theartofpracticalwisdom.com. And they can also follow me on YouTube, which is my channel is The Art of Practical Wisdom. And I'm trying to put up videos on my channel, a lot of this similar material to what you and I've talked about today. So I'm trying to just put it out there for anybody because I want everybody to heal. I've spent 40 years working on healing myself, and I call myself a codependent in recovery. And so every day I'm working on boundary setting, and I believe that we're learning until the day we die. So check out my channel, The Art of Practical Wisdom, watch the videos, read my books, and keep on doing your beautiful work.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you so much, Robert. It's been my pleasure and honor listening, having a conversation with you today. I look forward to more conversations. There's so much more to unpack. And I again, thank you. And thank you all for watching. And, if you have any comments that you'd like to leave below, feel free to do so. We want to hear from you. And just again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.